would like to follow up with a question about the specific forms of American and European denialism. Do you think that these forms can be adequately distinguished? And do you think that there are patterns of a global convergence in denialism?
I got interested in this whole question initially because of a big difference between what was happening in Europe versus what was happening in the United States. So if you go back to the early 2000s, I was spending quite a bit of time in Europe. I had a collaborative project with some colleagues in London, in the London School of Economics, and the conversation about climate change was very different than in the United States. So here in the United States, the conversation was often about climate change as a big debate. We didn't really know. Scientists weren't sure. Whereas in Europe, everyone thought, yeah, we know this is happening. And people were much more having a conversation about what the solution should be. And even the private sector conversation was different. So I remember landing at Heathrow Airport in London and seeing big signs that said BP, Beyond Petroleum. So this was the largest petroleum corporation in Britain, one of the largest in the world, saying that they were going to move beyond petroleum and adopt renewable energy. So it was very radically different. And so I became interested in that difference. Why was this conversation seemingly so much more advanced in Europe? And part of the answer to that question was about climate change denial and the role of the fossil fuel industry and also these right-wing think tanks like the Marshall Institute, but also the Cato Institute, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the Heartland Institute, who were promoting doubt and disinformation about climate science and opposing climate action. And so when Erik Conway and I wrote Merchants of Doubt, we were really focused on this American story because we thought it was a story that needed to be told. Since then, things have changed, and we have seen the export of American climate denial to other countries. And I mean that quite literally. We have seen arguments that were not used in Europe 20 years ago being used there now. And in some cases, we can document the links from American denialist groups to groups in the United Kingdom and continental Europe. And there's a group called the Atlas Network, which is a kind of umbrella group that was created to facilitate the exchange of information and I think also probably funding between right-wing think tanks, libertarian, anti-government think tanks in the United States and comparable groups overseas. So what we've seen now is that many arguments that would not have been made in Europe 20 years ago are now being made there. And so in that sense, I would say we have to sadly conclude that the conversation in Europe has actually gone backwards.
I would like to follow up with the next question about the history of agnotology. And since you mentioned the difference between an outward lie and the fact to exploit scientific uncertainty, I would like to ask you to explain to us the very domain of agnotology.
Agnotology is the study of ignorance. Now, you might not think that people need to study ignorance, but historically, historians of science, philosophers of science, have really been interested in the production of scientific knowledge. And traditionally, again, both historians and philosophers have seen the production of knowledge as a process which maybe it's not linear, but it still has a kind of directionality that knowledge is assumed to increase over time. But in fact, there are forces that cause knowledge to decrease. There are forces that cause ignorance to increase. And so I became interested in this a few years ago because of my work on climate change denial and attacks on climate science. And I started working with a group of other colleagues, including Robert Proctor and Londa Schiebinger at Stanford, who were developing this field that they were calling agnotology. That is to say, the study of ignorance, and particularly the social construction of ignorance, the way in which certain social, political, cultural, or economic patterns could in fact foster ignorance. And that includes both deliberate and inadvertent. So there are people who we know have deliberately tried to create ignorance. The tobacco industry obviously is high on that list. But there are also ways ignorance can be produced accidentally or inadvertently. And so in agnotology, we're interested in both. Probably there's been maybe a little bit more emphasis on the deliberate, what I like to call malevolent actors. But I think the study of the non-malevolent actors is important as well, because it's relevant to the whole question of how scientific knowledge develops. So in my recent book, Science on a Mission, it's a history of Cold War oceanography, I look at this question in a context that's not malevolent. The U.S. Navy was trying to foster science It was trying to foster oceanography and marine geophysics because it understood that having a good scientific understanding of the ocean would help it do its job better. So its intentions were honorable, but by focusing on certain kinds of questions that were related to the Cold War, and particularly questions related to submarine warfare, other areas of oceanography atrophied or even died out completely. And so knowledge was produced in some areas, but ignorance was also produced in others. And so in that book, Science on a Mission, I look at the trade-offs. I look at this question of how, even with good intentions, we can still sometimes foster ignorance simply based on the choices we make about what we think is important to study, and also especially who's funding it.
Great.
Good. All right.
This is awesome.
All
This
right.
is exciting.